This talk is on the subject of individual memorials or monuments of status in association with charnel or charnel chapels in late medieval England. As has been said, I'm looking at post-medieval charnelling in the context of my PhD, but the story of charnelling in England really begins in the late medieval period, so that's what we'll be looking into a little bit tonight. So first of all, what is charnel? What do we mean by this word? In archaeology, charnel is used to refer to disarticulated human remains. So in turn, what do we mean by disarticulated? Well, on the right here is a token example. I've chosen a rumoured witch skeleton, which isn't really a witch because of the occasion. And this could really be anything. This is just a token example of an articulated burial. And you can see that all of the bits of the skeleton broadly relate to all the other bits of the skeleton in the sense that you would expect them to. They sort of represent the anatomical order of the body. And this is what we would call an articulated burial. Disarticulated remains, on the other hand, do not represent this order. And you can see that in this further token example on the right. This is the charnel collection at St. Leonard's Church in Hythe in Kent. And when these bones are mixed together, we might also call them commingled. That's a fancy word, it just means they're all mixed together. Now, in these charnel deposits or collections or assemblages, however you might want to refer to them, there is often more than one individual present, and that's definitely the case in this picture on the right. And these collections of remains are usually generated via burial disturbance, so the disturbance of historic, perhaps even recent burials in the ground, depending on the situation. And this often results in the redeposition of charnel. So whether charnel is redeposited in the ground, in the grave, or in a hole in an orderly or a disorderly manner, or whether it's redeposited above ground, stored, again, in a disorderly or orderly manner, all of that will come under our nice, warm, cozy charnel umbrella. But we'll be looking at these above ground collections with a bit of order to them today. So a bit more like the one on the right of the screen there. So in terms of late medieval England, where does charnel come from? Why is it a thing? Well, we start with the idea of burial ad sanctos. So this is burial in holy ground, in consecrated ground. So if you imagine a church or a cathedral or any other sort of ecclesiastical foundation, that is a consecrated space. It's been blessed for its religious purpose. And you can imagine often, or see often, around these sites, there will be a further area of land which is dedicated to burial, constituting usually a churchyard. And this is ground which has been further blessed or further consecrated for the sakes of burial. So this is the good place. This is where you want to be buried. And in fact, in this period, burial beyond the churchyard is punitive. You know, it's a punishment after death. So you really want to be within the churchyard. But these are limited spaces. They have boundaries, whether that be a wall or a hedge or a fence or something like that. The consecration doesn't extend forever. It has a limitation, and that's what makes it special. And the result of this is that over time, when you have people being buried in these spaces repeatedly, the ground becomes saturated with human remains. So we have an example on the right here. This is from a French book of hours from around 1500. But this is the problem that we have in England and indeed all over Europe pretty much around this period, in these burial grounds which have undergone centuries of cumulative and consecutive use. And you can see that this grave digger has dug himself a new grave, nice new grave, but in the process of doing so, he has disturbed some historic remains, a historic burial. So there's this scattering of loose charnel around the edge of the grave cut, and our chap down there in the hole is holding up a skull and a long bone. And he looks a bit confused in this drawing, but he needn't look confused because this was quite a regular occurrence. This was fairly common. And if you look at depictions of burial in late medieval books of hours, you will often see scenes like this, where there is a scattering of charnel represented around the grave cut. So the immediate solution to this is just to rebury these remains. You've got a big hole in the ground. Why not? It gets them out of the way. It's nice and easy, quick, tidy. Just keeps everything moving and no one gets in too much trouble. However, the problem further arises through the continued reuse of the ground, that when this plot of ground is reused again in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, wherever, the next gravedigger along is now disturbing 2 sets of historic human remains. And a bit further down the line, maybe 3 sets, 4, 5, 6, and as you can imagine, it becomes a bit less tenable, a bit less practical to just sweep all of this stuff back into the ground with every new grave cut. This does happen in some cases. You see the rising of the earth level of churches, these very high churchyard walls. But in a lot of cases, this was also causing an issue. So we have a great account here from Bury St Edmunds, and this comes to us via the 19th century antiquarian Matthew Holbeck Bloxham. And the abbot remarks that when lately passing over the cemetery allotted for the burial of the common people, he observes, not without sorrow of heart and pressure of vehement grief, how very many of the graves had been violated by the multiplied burial of bodies, and the bones of the buried indecently cast forth and left. So this gives us an idea of some of the states that these churchyards were getting into around this time, the sort of late 13th, early 14th century. And indeed, you can see in the picture, just above the quotation, there is a scattering of charnel there that's just been left to one side in the churchyard. So if the problem is that the ground is becoming stuffed and saturated with all of this material, the solution, you'd think it might be stop stuffing it with material, but you have to keep burying people. And this is the place where they have to be buried. So the next thing you can do is to sort of de-stuff the ground. I don't think that's a scholarly term, but that's what was happening. So that sort of helps you clear up this space for future burials when you're disturbing old remains, but it leaves you with the further problem of what do you do with these remains? If you're no longer putting them back in the ground, where do they go? Because they're too important to just throw in the tip, throw in the river. They're human remains. They're needed for the resurrection, and they have to stay on consecrated ground for everything to run smoothly. Our answer, very conveniently, comes along in the late 13th century. The Pope, in 1274, declares that purgatory, guess what, guys, it's a real thing. People have been talking about purgatory for quite a while at this time. The word has been out there, this idea of a liminal state that the souls of the dead reside in after death and before, the lovely end of times when everything gets sorted out. But there's been no official word on it up until this point. What this means is that purgatory is now real, is very, very real. This liminal state, this is where souls go, and by all accounts, it's not very pleasant. Depictions like that on the right, lots of sort of fire and burning and flames and all sorts of nasty stuff going on. The idea is that this is a place where souls are cleansed of their residual sin. It's sort of wrung out of them like a wet, burning flannel. A better metaphor would have sufficed there, but hopefully that does the job. However, we are in luck. We are not stuck with this in totality. There is not a cure, but some sort of medicine to help us out in the form of intercessory prayer. And this is the prayer of the living on behalf of the souls of the dead. This doesn't get these souls out of purgatory, but it helps sort of speed things along. They spend less time in this horrible situation. They move forward quicker. And with that comes an economic value, because you want to sort of make sure ahead of time, hopefully, that you're not spending too long in this place. So people with a bit of money could leave a bit of money aside, give it to the church, say, please pray for my soul for, however much or however long they could afford or they could specify. People with a bit more money could afford to found altars, chantry altars or foundations, where members of the clergy would pray on behalf of their souls, or the souls of their families or their houses, whatever was specified. And prayers of the clergy are more valuable in this context than those of the laity, because the clergy are a little bit closer to God in this hierarchy. So this is paid intercessory prayer for private individuals. What about everyone else there? Because we're all going in the same purgatorial direction. This is where charnel chapels come along. Charnel chapels are a related but distinct kind of foundation. rather than housing paid intercessory prayer for private individuals, their main purpose is to offer intercessory prayer for the laity, for the poor, as a benefactory measure. It's a charitable thing that's going on here. And these often consisted of a chapel above and a charnel below. And we can see an extant charnel chapel structure on the right here. This is at Norwich, and you can see these pointed windows at the top. They're representing the chapel section of the structure, and we have these quite unusual round windows below, which would illuminate the crypt below where the bones would be stored, providing light to that space for its use, but also ensuring that the bones were visible from outside the building. So whenever you're moving around these structures in the cathedral close, you will be seeing human remains. They're just there. They're a part of life. And if we go back to Bury St. Edmunds, we follow up on our quote of the previous slide. After the abbot has walked around and seen all of these bits of skeletons lying around the churchyard and got quite annoyed at how untidy it is, or quite sad at how untidy it is, I'm sure, he directs that a chapel should be built, a good stone chapel, and he wants a space beneath where these bones can be stored, and he wants a chapel above to accommodate the perpetual celebration of the masses of two chaplains. So we have this association of charnel storage below and associated ritual of curation and intercessory benefits going on above. Not all charnel chapels were freestanding like that one. When they existed in association with smaller foundations like parish churches, they more regularly took the form of a crypt below an aisle or below a chapel with an associated altar above. But in all cases, the remains were stored in an orderly way. There was this orderly stacking of remains, and this emphasis in contemporary documents on their cleanliness. They're not being redeposited with earth all over them, but they're being sort of brushed off, and their decent and seemly preservation for the resurrection. And on the right here is an example of a late medieval-ish charnel deposit, which is extant. This collection still exists beneath the Church of Holy Trinity in Rothwell, Northamptonshire. It has since been rearranged for conservation purposes in the early 20th century, but this picture shows us what it was like before that happened. And this is not a fossilized late medieval charnel deposit. There are numerous post-medieval accounts of stacks sinking or collapsing or falling down and being restacked, but it's been curated and recurated in kind. So this gives us an idea of what the interior of these spaces most likely look like. There is an accessibility of remains here and a visibility. There are windows or inlets off to the right of this image. They're blocked up in the early 20th century at the time that this photo was taken, but they too would have allowed light in, illuminated the bones, and made them visible from outside in the churchyard. And the churchyard at this time is not a sort of static, quiet environment as much as it is now. Churches and churchyards were the centres of their community and community activity. So there is this very tangible and forward presence and involvement of the dead visually at all points around this structure. There's also accessibility going on here, because this stacking against the walls of the crypt leaves this clear central space. Now, whether this was left clear for religious or liturgical activity is speculated on. Whether it was just to allow further stacking of the bones, who knows? I tend to lean towards the former myself, and there is a recent paper, which I will include a reference to at the end, which speculates more on the possible liturgical functions of these spaces, if that's something that you're interested in reading further about. And here's just another early 20th century postcard, and I think what's quite nice here in the detail is that you can see there is this sort of banding of skulls across the stacks, just affirming that this was a process and a curation of care. They're not being thrown in. There's real thought gone into this arrangement. There's almost an aesthetic at play here. So, charnelling in late medieval England in a nutshell. A charnel crypt would be more appropriate, but we'll settle for a nutshell for now. On the one hand, it's pragmatic. we have the churchyard management aspect. These places are getting out of hand, they're getting untidy, a little bit indecent, and this helps them sort of tidy up and keep working, keep running smoothly, and remain palatable places for the community. But we also have this very strong theological aspect. We have the purgatorial idea, we have this context and this associated practice of intercessory prayer, and this is very much active curation of the dead. We have their orderly, neat redeposition, their seemly preservation for the resurrection, which we see an example of on the right here, some of these angels working their magic on these disarticulated scatterings of charnel on the ground of the churchyard. So there is this care, there is this forethought, it's a conscious process. Charnel is also visible and accessible. These windows are open, you can see these remains whenever you're passing by the church. Sometimes, let's say you're going into church in the morning and you have to walk past these windows. The dead are there. They're already there. They're already in church. They're beating you to it. And so there is this very tangible sense of their presence, which enforces and reinforces the spiritual presence of the dead, the persistent spiritual presence of the dead in this time period. Something else which I think is important about charnel collections, which hasn't been picked up on in the literature so much so far, so I am trying to drip it in wherever I can, is that these were also repositories of social memory. There was all this religious stuff going on, but there's also a very social thing here as well, because these crypts contain the community of the past, the present, and the future. Everyone from your town, your village, your settlement, city perhaps even, of the past, kith, kin, friends, family, that's where they are, or that's where they're ending up. They are there in the present. They are present around you and you around them. And that's also where you're ultimately going. And then at the end of times, when everyone is resurrected at one, all of the families and friends of this settlement from centuries past will all be reunited as one. And I think that's quite nice, apart from all these sort of the awkward small talk with distant aunts and uncles at Christmases, perhaps, but I don't think the theology accounted for that when it was being orientated. We'll move on. Ultimately, the thing to remember is that these were places for the laity and the poor. People who could afford sort of notable individual burials, individual monuments, individual places for, the idea of their perpetual burial, whether it was perpetual or not, they weren't generally ending up in the charnel house. This was the ordinary people. Despite this, however, there are some cases where high status individuals with wealth, with power, with status, specifically requested or specifically arranged for their own burial or commemoration or monuments even being raised in direct association, direct physical proximity to charnel and charnel chapels. So this talk is based on a forthcoming paper, which I'll include details at the end, and the dataset that I've compiled for that has identified around 40 late medieval burials and monuments of this kind. 9 of these burials, representing 11 individuals, there's a couple of doubles in there, had monuments recorded in association with them. Unfortunately, only 2 of these monuments are extant. However, we still have plenty to go off in terms of documentary and contextual material. And these 2 are just a nice little treat on top of that. They're like, well-deserved pudding. And the big question, of course, is why did this occur? Why did these people choose to invest their own remains and their own memories within these contexts, which were effectively elaborate common graves? There was a lot more to them than that in terms of the ritual significance, but, why would the man on the hill want to be buried with the person at the bottom? Let's run through some case studies. Let's get some data, let's have a little look. We're going to start at Old St. Paul's Cathedral. We're going to work toward a guy called Henry Barton. So this is Old St. Paul's, or at least a late 19th century imagining of Old St. Paul's. And the location of the charnel chapel is indicated on the right in that box there. And this chapel was founded around 1274, 1276. It was a real process narrowing that date down. That will be in the paper. I won't bore you with all the details now. There may have been an earlier vault or crypt on site for charnel storage. The cathedral was expanded from the mid to late 13th century in a programme of works referred to as the New Work, which disturbed a lot of remains, so they probably needed somewhere to put them. However, the chapel itself is first referred to in 1276, so they were really quite quick off the mark, quite keen and ready to jump into that new hamster wheel designed by this papal purgatorial decree in 1274. However, whatever chapel they had at the time may not have been all that, because it was reconstructed in 1282. And perhaps that's no surprise, because they were still working out how to do these things. It was new. The conventions of what they should look like and how they should function, I think, were still being teased out at this point. The 1282 reconstruction was undertaken as a joint project between the church and the city. So the local merchants and the City of London wanted to raise some shops against the churchyard walls. The Dean and Chapter said, yes, you can do that if you help us out of it. And it was agreed that the city would donate 10 marks toward the chapel's construction, and then a further 5 marks per year thereafter for its maintenance. Importantly, this was also situated in direct proximity to Paul's Cross, which we can see in that second box there. And Paul's Cross was more or less the sort of the beating heart of social life in late medieval London. It hosted all manner of outdoor preaching, proclamations, announcements, sometimes even punishments. All sorts of stuff was going on here. And in the image on the slide, this has been represented as quite an empty precinct. Imagine it as a full precinct. Imagine it as bustling, full of people. So you have the present unfolding, these constant renegotiations of the present occurring in direct proximity in relation to this repository of the past and the people of the past. So in terms of an intersection of religious and civic life, there's quite a lot going on here. And of course, you have the bones visible through these windows at all times. Anyone who's walking past in the precinct is seeing the dead. In terms of accessibility, from 1302 onward, the chapel was open to pilgrims on Fridays and specified feast days. So whether this was just the chapel above or the crypt below as well, we're not really sure. However, the dead remain visible at all times through those windows. And Dugdale, in his cathedral history, reports that they were decently piled together within there. They were attended with great respect and care. So anyone working in heritage or policy who's used to hearing this mantra of care, respect, decency, respect and care, it's been going on for 350 years. Nothing new there. Dugdale got there first. But Henry Barton, he's the guy who brought us here. What's going on with Henry Barton? This chap died in 1435. We can safely assume he was born at some point before then. I don't have the date on hand. We don't need it for our purposes today. He was a prominent member of the Skinners Guild, and he held numerous civic positions in his life. And this is really a moment for a deep breath in advance of this list of this partial list, I should say, of his achievements. Sheriff, 1405. Alderman of Farrow Ward without, 1405. Alderman of Cornhill, 1412. Member of Parliament, 1419. Lord Mayor of London, 1416 and 1428. Lifetime annuity conferred by Queen Anne in 1394, subsequently confirmed by Richard II. He was a keeper of the Great Wardrobe to 2 successive kings as a skinner, in his capacity as a skinner. He was also a considerable property owner and loaned quite a lot of money to the crown. So that's 2,100 quid by 1423, which is not to be sniffed at. So why tell you all of this? The point that I'm trying to make in here is that Henry Barton was a bit of a somebody. This was a guy with wealth, with power, with respect, a figure of consistency and reliability throughout the succession of numerous monarchs throughout this time period. He could have been buried anywhere that he wanted, in the cathedral itself, I'm sure, if he had requested. But where does he ask to be buried? In the chapel of the charnel of St. Paul's. He had a monument in this chapel. Stowe tells us in his summary that it was a fair tomb with an image of alabaster grated about with iron. But he was not alone there. There were 2 more. He was joined by Robert Barton, another Skinner, and later on in the early 16th century by Thomas Murphin, also a Skinner, also a Mayor. All three of these entombed with their images of alabaster over them, grated about with iron. So there's a theme here, there's a continuity between these monuments. Our descriptions are limited, but there seems to be something in common between them. Significantly as well, Barton's tomb had already been made and installed by the time he died. He refers to it and its location in his probate. Murphin as well, his tomb had already been made and installed in advance. So these were very conscious choices, conscious decisions made during lifetime. That is where I want to be buried, and I will make that happen by making it happen. Unfortunately, none of these monuments are extant. They were all sort of pulled down by Somerset in 1549, but that's another story for another time. So what do we have at Old St. Paul's? Let's just quickly recap. Let's do another nutshell. We've got 3 Skinners, including 2 former mayors, the civic and religious heart of London, negotiating the present in relation to the past. We've got all these things going on in this space. And amidst all of this stuff, we have the visible ancestral dead in the charnel below. You could see them through the window at any moment. And then we also have the tangible effigies of past civic figures, of past mayors. So these chaps have been mayors in life, and they're sort of setting themselves up in a way as get ready for an awful image. Mayors of the Dead, for anyone who's into the works of George A. Romero, The Simpsons, and late medieval London all in one. I spent 10 minutes making that. I will never get them back. So we will move swiftly on. So we have really strong sort of civic and site-specific reasons why burial in St. Paul's Charnel would have been advantageous or desirable for these individuals. But this wasn't just happening at St. Paul's, this was happening elsewhere as well. So we need something more than site-specific reasoning to really get to the bottom of this. So let's move to another case study, John Woodhouse at Norwich. Woodhouse, like Barton, was a bit of a big cheese. He was royally connected. He did a lot of things. He died around the same time as well, so 5 years before. So we're talking the same kind of period here. He was a gentleman of the Privy Chamber to Henry IV, a Chamberlain of the Exchequer under Henry V. He fought alongside the king at Agincourt, and by fought alongside, I don't mean he was milling around in the crowd. He was there next to his friend, the king. He was also a member of Parliament for Norwich 4 times. He obtained the king's permission to found a chantry at Norwich as well. And this chantry, interestingly, was praying not just for the Woodhouse household, try saying that 5 times in a row, but also for the household of the king. So they're really getting on. They're really good friends. They're kind of setting themselves up together in death as well as in life. Equally, Woodhouse could probably have requested burial anywhere that he liked. But what does he request? He orders his body to be buried in the lower chapel of the charnel after mass said over it in the cathedral. So this isn't even the chapel above where it's nice and neat and tidy. This is right down below with the bones. He's later joined there by his wife. She outlives him, remarries, and is buried alongside her first husband in the charnel crypt a little bit later. So the structure itself was repurposed following the Reformation. This is the reason why it survives when not many do. It turned into a school upstairs, and it was a wine store downstairs for a while. And during some work done on the floor in 1850, a stone coffin was discovered. It contained 1 male and 1 female set of skeletal remains. There was a niche in the pillar which was said to have contained a light, and it was speculated that the burial had originally been marked by an altar tomb. And if that were the case, this would have rendered it the space's central and most prominent feature. The bones, just out of curiosity, were subsequently reinterred beneath a mid-19th century legistone with an inscription that sort of covers what we've covered so far. But what did this look like? Well, we've seen the outside of the chapel, now we're inside the crypt. Photograph very kindly supplied by A.D. Marsham of Norwich School. The crypt itself is currently the Crypt Gallery. It's an art gallery, hence these grey boards on the sides. So if you imagine these spaces marked B as containing stacked charnel, perhaps all the way along the walls, because we know that there was a lot of charnel here Bishop Salmon, when he founded this and he furnished it with charnel from the cathedral's yard, was very disappointed to find that he didn't have enough to fill the space. So he went around all the surrounding parishes, scooping up everybody else's churchyards, collecting up bones to put them in here with those from the cathedral. I suppose just to make it sort of look the part. I don't know why else. That sort of would encourage donation and visitation and that sort of stuff. So there's lots of little aspects going on here. But where the letter A appears in the middle on this brown rectangle, that is the 19th century ledger slab, and this little box that I've penciled in above it. If there was an altar tomb, as speculated, above the burial site, that's where it would have been. It might not necessarily have been there, it could have been one bay down, we don't really know. But in any case, you can see that there is this direct, very, very clear physical juxtaposition between the individual monument and the disarticulated anonymous charnel of the laity. We have a similar kind of setup at Hereford, the memorial or the monument of the Joneses. Who were they keeping up with? Who was keeping up with them? Those are the important questions which we will not answer today. Andrew died in 1497. Elizabeth, we're not really sure, or I'm not sure, somebody might be. And they have this incised slab in a sort of altar tomb configuration in the crypt at Hereford Cathedral. Jones himself was a merchant, possibly a cider merchant, because he is depicted standing on a tun. So that's quite a fun little monumental detail. And the inscription on this slab relates how in 1495, Jones rebuilt and repaired this carnery, which is another word for charnel, of long time desolate, and founded a lovely little chantry within. Importantly as well, this is the only known burial or monument in this space. And we can see in the picture it's located by a wall now, but it was formerly in a central position. And we do have some evidence, more recent evidence, sort of allowing us to visualize this a bit better. So on the right hand, we've got one of John Britton's sectional plans. That little notch marked A at the bottom, that's the centrally positioned tomb. And we also have this rather fuzzy picture on the left, which it doesn't do much, but hopefully it's helpful. And both of these monuments raise an interesting question about the position in relation to charnel, in relation to remains, the juxtaposition that's going on there. And they almost bring to mind transient tombs, which, I mean, this is a connection I haven't delved too far into. This is just a hot off the press. I'm sure someone will have very good opinions on this. Someone who's not me will be more informed. But in the transient tomb of the period, we have this comparison, this juxtaposition in a figural form between the living body and the decaying, the deceased body. So is something similar going on in relation to these charnel monuments, when we have these monuments, all these effigies, these depictions juxtaposed directly, in some cases, with these very real, tangible, actual human remains? Is that a more potent rendition of this sort of theme? Perhaps. I shall leave that question to anyone who wants to answer it. Let's move on to a fourth case study now. We're flying through, we're nearly there. Margaret de Say at Worcester Cathedral. Margaret died a bit earlier in 1230, and this is her lovely effigy. She was a very wealthy cathedral benefactor, very interesting lady in general, actually. I don't know of much work that's been done on her, and I would love to know more. She led a very interesting life and accrued a lot of wealth, and she did very well, so did the church. She funneled a lot of this money into Worcester Cathedral. She funded the construction of the Lady Chapel in the 1220s, and I don't know if you've seen pictures of Worcester Cathedral's Lady Chapel, but it is a particularly nice one. No expense spared kind of thing. However, this was constructed over the former monks' cemetery. So there was a disturbance of charnel, old remains in the process. And the incumbent bishop decided, well, we have to have somewhere to put these. So around 1224, he founded what became the charnel chapel. Whether it was a charnel chapel initially, we're not really sure, because this is really early. This is 50 years before the Pope formalizes purgatory. So exactly what's going on here is Still a little bit confusing, but it's very, very interesting. There's definitely work to be done. In terms of Dessay, interestingly, her monument was not placed in the Lady Chapel. The Lady Chapel that she funded in its entirety, the really lovely, really nice Lady Chapel, which, if I was going to be buried in a Lady Chapel that I paid for, I think that would be the one. But no, her monument is installed in the Charnel Chapel, which again suggests this very conscious choice, this conscious desire. It almost seems counterintuitive, so there's definitely something behind it. And further to this, just underpinning the significance here, it has been characterised also as one of, if not the oldest non-ecclesiastical female effigies in England. So everything about this is interesting and cool, and there's only so much we can cover today, but that tells us just about what we need to move forward with. So to recap, we have a spreadsheet, because who doesn't love a spreadsheet, especially one halfway through a PowerPoint presentation. So all of the ones that we've covered appear in here, apart from 3 at the bottom. At St Mary's Abbey in Winchester, the Nunnaminster, John Leyland described 3 tombs of marble of custodian or custodial priests, so chantry priests, presumably, of that chapel around 1538. That's the only information we have on those, unfortunately, but best to include it for the sake of comprehension. So this brings us around to the question of, why do these things exist? Why did these people want to associate with charnel? At St Paul's, as we've discussed, we have our civic reasons, but clearly there's something broader, there's something wider going on and happening here in other spaces. In 2016, the doctoral thesis of Jenny Krangle was one of the first major works to look at channeling in late medieval England. Well, I consider it a major work. It's been major for me. That will be referenced at the end if you want to have a look. And Jenny describes the founding of charnel chapels as an act which would ingratiate the founder with the lay community and possibly gain them additional prayers for their souls. Because they're providing burial infrastructure, they are informing a service. As an example of this, if we pop over back to Nunnaminster with these 3 marble priest tombs, this was founded by Roger de Inkpen, the chapel, in 1318, but it was founded over an existing charnel crypt or charnel store, so they're already doing this here. And then Roger comes along and says, I'll give you a bit of money, stick my name over the door, I'll make it nice and tidy. They say, yes, please. This is an act of benefaction for both church and community. Roger is enriching the church materially, and he's helping to provide nice, new, shiny, fancy infrastructure for the local lay community. He is in effect shaping his memory as a benefactor. He's positioning himself in the longue durée, in the death, long after he's gone, as this provider of infrastructure and enricher of the space. But at the same time, he's also doing himself a big favour. He's investing his name, his individual memory, in this specific intercessory environment. And I tend to think of this like an insurance policy of sorts. Let's say 100, 150, 200 years down the line, what if something happens? What if the ink pens disappear off the face of the earth? What if nobody cares anymore? What if the money runs out? Does he still get his prayers? With his name above the door, and people regularly using this space, clergy and laity benefiting, I would bet on it. I think he's got a good one there. He's assured himself of this long-term remembrance in this specific intercessory space. This also makes sense for benefactors. So Jones at Hereford and Dessay at Worcester, they're doing the same thing. They're keeping their names, their memories alive in these specific spaces. But this could also arguably apply to chantry chapels in general. So what makes charnel even more special in this regard? Well, based on this idea of benefaction, we can contextualize charnel chapel foundation and these associated monuments within the context of the 7 corporal works of mercy, these great big 7 works of late medieval Catholicism that help you out. They help your soul out. They show that you are a good Christian. As we have in James, for as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also. It's all well and good believing these things and being all nice and kind to everyone, but if you have the means to effect change, positive charitable change, then the proof really is in the pudding. And these 7 works that we have listed below, they include feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, clothing the naked, giving shelter to travelers, visiting the sick, visiting the imprisoned, and also, last but not least, burying the dead. And in terms of the importance of burying the dead, we have this early 16th century rendering at the bottom here, which I'll just move backward. And you can see the burial of the dead is right in the middle. That's in the center. And that's the one with Jesus, Mary, and John looking down directly on top of it. There's focus here, there's energy. This is the central act. And so when people are choosing to invest their memories in these contexts, to invest in these structures and this sort of fabric, they are foregrounding their enactment of this most interesting of the 7 corporal works. They are facilitating the burial of the dead and the intercessory activity that surrounds them. Accordingly, Charnel Chapel Foundation charters, where they survive, they regularly foreground prayers above for all the faithful departed, sometimes especially those whose remains are contained therein. So again, founders, benefactors, individuals with memorials or specific burials who are investing their memories in this space, they are positioning themselves in a cognate manner. They are emphasizing that they are the people who are giving to the poor, to the laity in these spaces. They are enriching the spaces, they are enriching these chapels, they are keeping them ticking over in death as well as in life. And shouldn't we be thankful? Shouldn't we give them a few more prayers? So we come now to what I call the Charnel Chapel checkbook. If there was a late medieval game show, I think this might be a good title, but let's again move swiftly on. We have a nice little illustration on the side here, just a bit of fun. Commit thy body to the grave, pray Christ thy soul to save, and equally pay church might suffice for pay Christ to some degree. Because on the one hand, we have this material and financial investment in church and church. With these monuments, you know, it's big C and little c. It's the local church and it's the church as a wider body. And as well as perpetuating memory, they're ingratiating the clergy. They're effectively paying the clergy and keeping them, you know, in their books, in their good side. And the prayers of the clergy, of course, are these valuable prayers because they're closer to God. And they're assuring the longue durée perpetuation of their memory and directed prayer toward them in these specific intercessory environments. On the other hand, they're effecting this charitable provision for the laity and the poor. They're ingratiating not just the clergy, but seeking to ingratiate the laity because their prayers are valuable too. They are the humble poor, and it's worth having them on your side. And this is a sort of multi-generational idea in both cases. You know, the investment of a name that survives an individual, a name that outlasts living memory through its material investment in these spaces. It's proof of that benefaction. And this benefaction, of course, is coming through the provision of burial infrastructure, the satisfaction of corporal works. They're helping the poor, and they're positioning their memories in the context of charity and benefaction. They are cementing this legacy. Earlier, the proof was in the pudding, and now the proof is very much in the stone. But we still have this odd sort of contradiction. On the one hand, we still have this sort of, well, maybe I'm a bit cynical in calling it an insurance policy, but I think that's a bit of what was going on. We have this excellent positioning, which works for everyone, all involved parties, particularly the deceased. And there are many different ways of ensuring these purgatorial sort of intercessory ends, but charnel chapels, for the reasons explained, are particularly potent places to invest individual and monumental memory. Does this perhaps imply humility in death? For these wealthy individuals, for these powerful individuals? Is this their way of saying, for all my wealth, for all my power, for all my worldly goods, I too am in the charnel chapel, I too reside here with the bones of the communal anonymous masses? Is that a sort of humble me sort of gesture, sort of message? Perhaps, but at the same time, it is ironically a privilege of the very wealthy. They are in their individual burials, their individual monuments, They are among the communal dead, but they are constantly apart and a little bit above. So there's a little bit of something else going on here. There's a little bit of lots of little something else is going on here, which assures that this contradiction remains. But I think at the end of the day, maybe that's part of the point. Maybe it is this idea that humility conquers pride. And by investing their memories in these environments, they are setting themselves up, they are positioning their memories in a more advantageous way, in so many more ways than one. And that is that for me. I hope you found this interesting, maybe even enjoyable. Who knows? Here is the promised final slide, the details of the forthcoming paper up at the top, and some references and further reading down below if anyone's interested in following up on those. So without further ado, thank you all very much again for listening, and I will hand back to our evening's gracious hosts.